Welcome. This is Professor Zafari, and we're continuing our studies of 20th century humanities by talking about existentialism. As you know from your reading, existentialism is the most influential philosophy of the 20th century. So in this first video of a series of 4, we're going to talk about understanding the importance of historical context. When analyzing works of creative art, whether they're music, literature, visual arts, architecture, or theological or philosophical writings such as existentialism, it's important to analyze them within their historical context. So what does this mean? How do we do it? Is all what we will be discussing in this first video. Much of the information that you'll see here is from the source Existentialism, Life After War. It is an essay available on the web, published by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So let's get started. What do we mean by this phrase, historical context? The moods, the attitudes, the conditions, the events, all of what is happening at a specific time in history. So it is the setting for an event, or in our case, as we are discussing and learning the humanities, it is the setting for the creation of a creative art. And we are studying the historical context with the understanding that the context will have an impact on the relevance of the event. It will have an impact on the relevance of the creation of the work of art. So what do I mean when I ask you in your next critical thinking essay to analyze a creative work within its historical context? Well, what I'm really asking you to do then is to refer to the moods, attitudes, conditions that existed during the time of the creation of that work. And again, we're operating under the assumption that the historical context will have an impact on our analysis. So let's take a look at a couple of examples from topics that we've already studied. As we begin to analyze the historical context of a work, we can ask ourselves some key questions to get us started. First, what was happening at the time of the event or the time of the creation of the work of art that might shed some light on it? And I think this question can really be illustrated by our analysis of shooting an elephant. Whether you recognized it or not, the historical context very much shaped your analysis. What was happening at the time that Orwell created what was happening at the time that Orwell wrote the essay? Or what was happening at the time in which the essay is set? So the imperialistic background, the imperialistic context of what was happening in that historical moment in Burma very much shapes the events and our understanding of this essay. And then another question we can ask to further understand the historical context is what type of society was the background for this event? What type of society then was in place that the story then emerges from? And this, I think we can really understand its significance if we take a look at Freud. I would argue we cannot fully appreciate the work and the revolution that Sigmund Freud's ideas brought to the 20th century if we don't consider the historical context. In 2014, if I make the statement that human behavior is ultimately driven by sexual desire, I'm not going to get much of a reaction. We see sex all the time in our movies, in our television programming. But in the late 19th century, in the historical context within which Freud was developing his ideas, to state that sexuality is the driving force of human motivation and human behavior. That was a very revolutionary statement. It was very much counter to the ideas of his time. So the historical context of Freud's ideas really helps us understand just how revolutionary this man's ideas are. We can continue then by trying to apply some of these ideas of historical context to existentialism. As I mentioned, existentialism is the most influential philosophy of the 20th century. And to fully understand it, and to fully understand why it was so influential, let's go back and let's look at the historical context in which it emerged. First of all, existentialism came after World War II. And this is incredibly significant. I can't emphasize it enough. We're talking about a philosophy that emerged in a post-war world. 45 million people are dead. We have a horrific number of suicides during this period. And we've just seen the horrific power of science and technology. Not only in the horrific way that human beings were tortured and killed during the Holocaust, but also in the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What we see during this time then is that the massive loss of life and the indelible, the unforgettable horrors of the Holocaust and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki leave us in a sense of despair, disillusionment, and skepticism. In this context, with all of this happening, it was very difficult for people during this time to believe that human beings are rational by nature. Difficult to continue in this optimistic spirit that technology will make human life better. And it was increasingly difficult to believe that the universe is governed by a benevolent God. So when we take into account the historical events of this period and people's reactions, it was an unparalleled era of devastation.